All right. Hello. Welcome. My name is Zia Weiser. I'm the senior climate reporter at Politico. And I'm delighted to have with me today the Irish Minister for Climate, Environment and Transport, Eamon Ryan, who is hopefully connected. I cannot see him yet, but yeah.
Good morning, Zia. I hope you can see me now.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much. Welcome, Minister.
Good to see you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today remotely from Ireland, which has just held elections. And I'm afraid that is the first thing I am going to ask you about because, unfortunately, the Green Party, which you used to be the leader of, was, well, I wouldn't say wiped out, but I think they've lost all but one seat, right, as things stand. What happened there?
Oh, it was very difficult, very disappointing for us, but we'll come back, and we'll come back stronger. We've done that before. We lost all our seats having come out of government in 2011. We're not there now. We still have a presence in the Dáil, and that'll be very useful for us. We believe we worked well in government. I think most independent analysis would say, God, you really did deliver. And it was on a climate ticket that we ran and delivered. Sometimes delivering is difficult because you're changing things. And even though the long run, that I think would be very beneficial, it can be very unpopular in the short run. We also were subject, I suppose, in government to a lot of attacks from vested interests, many cases. And that also kind of poisons the well, I think, a little bit of public opinion about you. It's a difficult time right across Europe. We think we've seen in a variety of elections, the high point we had in 2020 for green thinking has reduced somewhat, but it'll come back. I mean, I've been 35, 40 years involved in environmental politics, and I've seen in that time the tide go in and the tide come out. And it will come back in because, unfortunately, the reality of the ecological crisis is not going away. So we'll regroup. We have a European Green Party meeting in Dublin, as it happens, this weekend. So we'll use that to share experiences with our European colleagues, and we'll come back all the stronger. We're determined about that.
Right. Do you not think that weaker green parties across Europe risk translating to weaker green policy, as they've usually been sort of a driving force, at least driving the conversation forward? Is that something that you might talk about? Also, as you just mentioned, there's the Green Party Congress in Dublin this week. Is that something that's going to be a talking point there?
I think it will be, and I think like having a strong green presence does increase ambition. It does. We do bring a particular focus and a particular experience, and I think the absence of that would be very damaging to Europe's green transition. I think one of the things I'd be saying is, I think this green transition is inevitable in any case. We would accelerate it, and I think we've real expertise in how you deliver it, with just transition being at the core. Social justice and ecological justice go hand in hand. And the reason I think it's inevitable, I was at the European Council, Energy Council, and also Environmental Council last month. And it was interesting that we were asking the question, is this ploughed for decarbonisation? Is that good for our competitiveness or bad for our competitiveness? And that is, I think, a focus a lot of European parties and European citizens at this moment in time. And I think it didn't take too long to think about it. We're not going to be competitive burning imported fossil fuels, be that from Texas or Kuwait or Qatar. Europe has only one viable economic strategy, as well as, in my mind, a strong social strategy, and that is continuing with this Green New Deal. And I think earlier this year, we saw before the end of the last mandate, we did see some of the other parties, the EPP and others, and maybe even President von der Leyen's Commission, kind of wavering somewhere from that. I don't think that's the case now. I think, having thought about it, we only have one course of action in Europe, particularly. I mean, globally it's the same, but particularly for Europe, for our economic development, to go with this Green New Deal. And I think the election of the Commission last week the nature of who we have there. My good friend Teresa Rivera as the Vice President, Wubka Hutstra as our Climate Envoy, and Dan Jorgensen as our Energy Commissioner. That speaks to me about only one sense of direction. So, and I think in many ways that the tide may come back in green thinking sooner than people think. It may do so in response to a Trump presidency. That's what happened. I mean, the last wave of strong green thinking came during that first Trump presidency, and I think the economic requirement for us to make this change will be one further reason why it's not going to stop in Ireland and elsewhere.
Right. I mean, you've also just been at COP, where you were one of the co-facilitators on the adaptation track. And I feel like also there we heard a lot of this rhetoric of inevitability, that it doesn't matter that if Trump comes back because the energy transition is underway. But to me, the question is, not so much of if it's underway, but if it's going fast enough to actually reduce emissions in a way that will stave off the most catastrophic impacts. And I'm wondering if you think that's something that is also happening, or is that more of a concern that we're not doing this fast enough?
We're not doing it fast enough. The science is clear, the physics you can't argue with. The figures, I'm sad, I look at it up pretty much every day. The concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere is up now to 425 parts per million. We need to get it back to 350, and it's still going up year on year. So, and clearly the impacts of climate change are hitting home far faster than we would originally predicted. So, and also, the scale of the change now is beyond compare. Again, at another earlier Energy Council, Environment Council meeting this summer, an informal meeting, the IPCC, the panel of climate scientists, came to our council and said their analysis is we're to still stay below 1.5 degrees or bring it back below 1.5 degrees. We might have some 200 gigatons of emissions that we can still allow into the atmosphere, and we're emitting 40 gigatons a year. So, no one could be but honest in terms of we're not moving fast enough. Now, having said that, and the reason we need to move fast is because there are tipping points that we won't know we've crossed until after crossing them, and that could lead to runaway climate change. Having said that, there are also tipping points on the positive side. I'm very involved in the International Energy Agency. Their analysis is that this year will be the first year that the investment in the clean energy alternative will go over 2 trillion a year. And that's almost twice now what the investment in new fossil is. So there is an exponential, going back to what Nicholas, the previous speaker, was saying about the need for an exponential change. It's happening in solar, it's happening in renewables across the board, but we do need to accelerate it. And not just in that, but the electrification of transport, the electrification of heat. And Europe, as I said, can and will be good at this, so we need to go further. One thing I would say, though, if I can, just referring to the COP29 negotiations, the other thing that might give you hope, in my mind, is that we were still able to get an agreement in Baku in very, very difficult circumstances. And I know a lot of development organisations and environment NGOs were critical that the public finance element wasn't large enough. And yes, it should have been larger. But there was broad agreement, not just for the investment in the developed world, but also in the developing. The provision of 1.3 trillion by 2035 per annum. And that ability to get an agreement, even in a very divided world, with protectionism on the rise, wars, savage wars taking place, that gives me, again, it's certain hope that we can still do this and that we can make the scale and speed of change we need to make.
But speaking of accelerating it, what do you see as the EU's role, both looking at its, perhaps let's start with its own policies rather than global action. What would you expect from the European Union going forward, perhaps this commission that has just started its new mandate, to try to speed up the pace of this transition?
Well, I think, again, I'd never bet against the European Union. Maybe I'm biased in that. I've seen this get through so many scraps, including recently the loss of Russian gas because of the Ukraine war, and we managed that as an Energy Council. I think in terms of, and also the fact that in the last commission we're able to agree some 25 pieces of Fit for 55 legislation. That gives us a strong regulatory toolbox, sense of direction. In my mind, what comes next then, the real focus is around what was recommended in the Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi reports. I think both actually steer us in the right direction. And it does steer us towards a more integrated European Union. I think if you look at what we need to do in the clean energy transition, it is moving to a much more European approach. We don't do that, in truth. Our electricity markets are still fragmented. Our TSOs still think in national lines. Our regulatory system similarly. And I do think probably one of the biggest ways in which Europe can retain its competitiveness and advance this electrification of everything is go to much stronger market integration in the electricity markets. Fundamentally, and like we've been rowing for years now about nuclear versus renewables, and the row isn't actually about the technologies in my mind. It is slightly different competitive positions in France and Germany and other countries. I think we're going to have to get over that. And I think we're going to have to integrate both nuclear and renewables. It's going to be largely renewable. They like 87% of the global investment last year was in renewable power. It's not stopping. It's the cheapest. But it does require balancing systems, and that does require markets to be integrated, much more interconnection, and much more coordination of that balancing of the electricity supply. Europe doing that, that's our only way of bringing the cost of electricity and therefore our industrial strength back. And I think that's probably one of the most important. Similarly, what Letta is saying on the kind of stronger capital markets and the ability to integrate our kind of, we're a very wealthy continent. We have €35 trillion in savings. Making sure that that doesn't go to New York, but we start to spend it here at home, I think is one of the key developments. And if I can go back on that, I keep going, because Ireland really does focus on this. The need for us not to see the developing countries frozen out of that is in our interests. It's in our interest that Africa starts to rise in this investment because that reduces conflict, reduces forced migration, but it also maybe guarantees us the global standards and transparency and rules that make for this faster decarbonisation, but also it's one where there's work for everyone. Like there's European companies involved in that, but also it'll see the developing countries rise. And I think that's actually really important as part of what we need to do next.
Yeah. Before, I wanted to ask you about the global aspect, but just to seize on a point you just mentioned, do you think that whole squabble around nuclear power in the EU, between France and Germany in particular, has been rather unproductive for holding things up?
I think it does, because we focus so much on it. I think, as I said, it's as much about competitiveness as anything else, because France might have an advantage. It can extend the life of its nuclear power plants, depreciate the cost all relatively, not have to pay the decommissioning or the new construction cost, and maybe see it as an electricity market price advantage over its neighbours. But I think that in the long run would not be good for Europe, would not be good for France. I do think we have to, it's there as a reality, and I'm very glad that we're now interconnecting with France, and we'll balance some of that variable wind power that we have with their clean nuclear supply as well. So it's not that you're going to deny, that technology is there and people are going to use it. That's a reality. But we do need to integrate, because ultimately, if we don't collaborate together, it'll be very expensive for everyone. Bruegel did a very good study earlier this year looking when you do go towards an integrated market in electricity markets, you save some €34 billion a year. And by the way, that includes the UK. In energy terms, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement allows us to collaborate in energy and electricity markets particularly. And there's a physical reality there in the middle of our market, particularly for Ireland, we're the island behind the island. But that analysis from the likes of Bruegel and others is the really compelling reason why we do it. It's in all our interests to do this in a balancing, coordinated European way. And I think there's an acknowledgement of that. We're always talking about it, but do we actually do it? No. And partly because we just spend our whole time rowing about nuclear versus renewables. We need to move on from that.
Yeah. And to zoom back out again, So, Europe, the emissions here are falling, and there's the sense that perhaps the European Union needs to help the rest of the world accelerate its emissions reductions. And that was also obviously a huge part of COP29, because you need to finance these emissions reduction measures somehow. I'm wondering if you think there is any space for the European Union to do more to help the rest of the world, the developing countries, particularly the poorest developing countries, and what that might look like?
Well, first we need to reduce our emissions ourselves.
Right.
And that's the first thing in terms of protecting everyone's future. But going back to the agreement in Baku, and in my mind, that 1.3 trillion figure is key. That's similar to, again, as I said, the IEA's analysis of what sort of investment you need in developing countries other than China. But also it refers, I think, to the high-level expert group of economists, Nicholas Stern, Vera Sangwe, and Amara Bhattacharya, who did for the UNFCCC an analysis as what might be needed. And they indicated that sort of figure. At least 300, and those at least words are important, they were only put in at the last minute, but that is the public finance component. In truth, made up a lot of it by the likes of World Bank, IMF, and European Investment Bank financing. And actually, the European Investment Bank, by comparison to other regional development banks, is quite high in that regard. But that 300 billion is one element of it. But the layers we'll need on top of that now are going to be critical. And the fact that we got a commitment to go to that 1.3, we have to deliver it. What does that mean? Well, firstly, I was very pleased that the European Commission was very strong on the case for innovative sources of financing, which is a polite way of saying we might look to put a charge on the likes of aviation, shipping, fossil fuel producers, billionaires. And I do think that that's going to be a really critical development in the next year. Lawrence Tubiana is heading a global levies task force, which is looking at how that might work. This is not easy. The International Maritime Organization has already started looking at how it might apply in terms of maritime levies. And as I said, that's going to be a further component of, in my mind, really critical financing into the future, because it would be predictable. It would be outside, always just having to turn to an exchequer. It would be tackling the polluter pay or using the polluter pays principle. So I think that's important. I also think it's important that the Article 6 carbon markets does, on a really transparent, verifiable way, starts to contribute towards nature solutions particularly. And then there is a real issue and a need for private finance to come in as well. And I know, again, as I said, some development organisations and NGOs were saying, oh, private finance is not what's needed at all, it has to be public. I listened to the negotiators from the African Union and from some of the small islands and other lesser developed countries, and they said they really need private finance. That's what they're frozen out of at the moment. And what Mia Motley says is true. The fact that the debt they have is at 4 or 5 times the interest rates that we pay, that's an injustice that has to be tackled in private as well as in public finance. So I think that's the figure we need to focus on. How do we deliver that 1.3 trillion? And I think, as I said, part of the way you do it is having really good transparency, reporting, accounting rules for what's happening in the flow of rare earth materials, as well as energy investments and flows. And I think getting those reporting and accounting standards are going to be one of the most important things. You start to count in south-south flows, investment from China and other developing countries into other developing countries. And also you reduce the risk of corruption, you reduce the price of capital because you reduce the risk because it's a much more transparent and verifiable system of investment. And I think that's the hard yards gains we're going to have to make in the next year as we go to Belém, is to really start doubling down on those sort of standards and delivering those investment flows, as well as the 300 billion in public capital.
Right, but going back to the EU's own capacity to do something, as you said, we've got now a new finance target of 300 billion a year by 2035, which is triple that of the current target, 100 billion. Would you say that indicates that the European Union should triple its public financing for climate?
If you look at the existing 115 billion, the European Union was the largest contributor to that, and I'm very proud of that, and I'm proud that Ireland has one small element in it. We doubled our climate finance in the last 4 years, and it's all grant aid, not tied to anything. We will have to at least double again, and I think more, go towards tripling. If you think over a 10-year period, though, that's not a significant stretch in a sense, because inflation alone will bring a lot of the increase.
That's what a lot of the developing countries were saying, that that's actually going to be eaten up by inflation.
Yeah, they're right. Listen, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, in an ideal world, you would have looked for something like that figure being closer to 400 billion. And that's what I heard in the closing stages of the negotiations, would have been kind of a point that might have met what those high-level expert group was recommending. We weren't able to get that politically, in truth, not just because of what's happening in Europe or lack of ambition, but because of what's happening in the States and elsewhere. So, but there was a key, firstly, to get agreement was key. Had we let that agreement fall, in my mind, the Paris Agreement would have been absolutely at risk. And the one path we have, the one legal structure we have towards making this collective leap would have been in deep trouble. So I'm very glad that we did get an agreement. Like those who say no deal is better than a bad deal, I don't agree. And I think, yes, I would have preferred 400 rather than 300, but let's work, first of all, on where the other trillion is going to come from is going to be the really important test. And I think I think the European Union has a key role to play in that, because we were probably the main leaders out on some of those alternative mechanisms. The sort of questions that were asked in that conference that Macron hosted in Paris need to be answered. The Bridgetown initiative that Mia Mottley has established needs to be delivered upon, and I think Europe can have a strong role in that, as well as providing public finances.
Right. About like that greater reform of financial systems, is that something that that's something that, for example, Germany and the US were driving World Bank reform, but now there's going to be an incoming administration that is somewhat skeptical of climate policies and plans to drop out of the Paris Agreement once again. Does the EU need to look for other partners?
EU needs to work with everyone, and if my understanding is, and you're into the detailed rules now around the World Bank and others, is that it is not that easy for the US administration to single-handedly unwind some of the agreements and progress that's been made in with the likes of how the World Bank and the IMF operate. That's not just you don't have a single country veto on that, even in a large economy like the US. So I think Europe does. My sense is Europe's bilateral arrangements, firstly with the developing countries, is going to be critical and key here, because they're our nearest neighbours in many instances, but also, as I said, if we develop common cause on setting high standards and transparency around the trade in rare earth metals as well as in clean energy, that leads to a more secure system for everyone. We don't have to invest so much in weapons. We could invest more in the Sustainable Development Goals. When you have really good understanding of multilateral collaboration on this clean energy transition. So I think that's where our focus should be. It really serves us to get an agreement in Brazil now that allows us to kind of, that gives us certainty on where those investment flows are going to go.
Yeah. So we're running out of time, so I'd like to ask you a final question, which is, going towards Brazil, what does the European Union need to do in this coming year to sort of make sure that's a bit of perhaps a happier outcome than we had in Baku?
I think first and foremost, we also in these international negotiations, we have to keep and maintain and win the public confidence of our public at home. I mean, there's no point us going at a high level, diplomatic level and kind of all sorts of high talk if we don't have our people with us and don't have a very clear sense that this is the economic strategy that we're all rowing in behind. I think you need that domestic political support and capital to be able to influence international negotiations. So it is following through on what the Draghi report sets as a path, increasing innovation, increasing investment locally, while also setting international trade standards that help the developing countries rise. But first and foremost, you've got to do it at home. And I think the question is Europe a better place now with very extensive regulation to be able to do this? In what is the technological innovation is in digital as well as in clean energy as well as in transport. And is this kind of regulated, distributed network political system, the European Union, able to do that better than a centralised, more authoritarian type system, or indeed an American state which is drill, baby, drill? I think Europe actually has potentially, as I don't underestimate the European ability to be good at this electricity transition, this renewable clean energy transition. And I think, last words I'd say I was listening to Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, in the meeting he had with the European Union representatives in Baku, and he made that point. He said that this actually might, while it's a difficult time for Europe, in the switch to the clean energy revolution, we may still have an advantage and an ability to surprise ourselves and others. And we got to really get it right at home to be able to act on the international stage.
Minister Ryan, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us here. Thank you.
Thank you.